You're currently inside Mandalay Bay EF, and you are here for Defending Past the Hash with Seth Moore and Baris Sadai. Thank you, and please put your phones on vibrate. Nobody's ringtone is cool. Thanks, guys. Go ahead.
Good morning. We're here to talk about mitigations for Past the Hash, which are in Windows 10. So Past the Hash is really a term which kind of gets applied to multiple attacks, all of which encompass credential theft, which is at the heart of many high-profile attacks today. A couple of years ago, we had US newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal, New York Times were breached. Just last year, I believe, Sony Pictures, right around the release of The Interview, the movie, they had a big-time breach, lots of data dumped out they didn't want external. And then kind of my personal favorite, just because it's kind of a movie heist, is the Carbonac Group. And these guys made off with $1 billion by deeply infiltrating bank networks and computers and essentially setting up time drops at ATM machines. And they would just walk up, make a small withdrawal, and actually walk off with hundreds of dollars instead of $20. So all of these attacks use a feature that nobody really wants to live without in their OS, and that is single sign-on. So single sign-on is effectively delegating to the operating system the capability to act as you on the network, to access resources. No one wants to log onto the computer and then type their password every time they access a file share, internet site, something like that. They just want those things to happen. And that means the computer can act as you, and that means attackers, like the sorts who pull off these heists, steal those things, steal credentials off the device to act as you. So what does Past the Hash or credential theft look like in Windows? So before we can really start talking about it, we need to talk a little bit about what the architecture looks like. And on Windows, in this example, we show Alice and her laptop. There's something running called LSAS, which is the Local Security Authority Subsystem, LSAS. And it hosts all the authentication protocols and does a lot of security stuff in Windows. And here you can see it's hosting NTLM and Kerberos, the two most commonly used protocols on domains. So inside the logic, inside the memory of LSAS, for these protocols, we contain things which are stealable by the attacker. So an admin-level attacker can read any memory on the device that he wants to, which means he can read your NTLM hash, or we call it your NTOWF. It's kind of a mouthful. He'll steal that and be able to authenticate as you using NTLM. The attacker can steal your ticket-granting ticket key out of Kerberos, which means he can act as you using the Kerberos protocol. And if your user, like Alice in this example, is using a password, the attacker can keylog that password, steal it out of memory, or just social engineer or phish Alice. So once the attacker has one or multiple of these credentials, they take these and then replay them, forming a sort of chain reaction. So the chain reaction starts with one system, a foothold system, and it could just be something like a front desk PC that an administrator uses. And the administrator gets social engineered or something on Facebook, downloads some malware, and they're popped, they're owned. It happens that often that user is admin on their PC, which means the attacker or the malware can now harvest the credentials out of LSAS. Once the attacker does this, they can move to another system. Once they're on that system, they attempt to gain more credentials if there's administrator access, and then they go to more systems and more systems, gather more and more credentials until you're doomed, right? They've deeply infiltrated your network. It's kind of a big deal. So multiple technologies exist today to make credential theft more difficult. So one of these is multi-factor auth, which means you can't just steal one credential in order to completely take over someone's identity. You have to steal multiple things, such as their cell phone and a password. There's something we call strong credentials, which really means key-based credentials where a private key is in hardware, such as with a smart card or a FIDO keyring. The attacker cannot steal the private key via a software attack. And another solution to the problem, which kind of takes a different tack, is called token binding, which is the concept of credentials or tokens which are downloaded to the device as a part of authentication are then bound to that device cryptographically so that even if the attacker steals them, they can't replay them. They can only be used on the original device. So we have some cool technology. It's well known, but we can't always deploy it because businesses like to make money. It's what they do. And the corollary to that is they don't want to spend more money than they have to. So businesses have lots of legacy components, like a printer or a file server that only talks in TLM. And the businesses don't see a big return on replacing those. So these old devices use legacy protocols, and these legacy protocols are vulnerable to the attacks, such as pass the hash. So our challenge here is defending against these attacks on legacy protocols without requiring a lot of upgrading of these devices, which requires keeping secrets, which I'll let Baruch talk about.
Thank you very much, Seth. Good morning, everyone. My name is Baruch Seidak. I am one of the leads in security assurance team in Windows Devices and Group. This section is about keeping secrets and remaining productive. Keeping secret is not very difficult, actually. Let me share a story with you. Long time ago, perhaps in a galaxy far, far away, an emperor told its army to get ready for a big military campaign. Fearing information disclosure, though, he doesn't share the exact timelines or the target country. He wants to catch them off guard. One of the generals figured if he knew the details, he could prepare his army much better. He could prepare the tactics, prepare the gear, size of the teams, everything. So he insisted on knowing the details. He kept asking the emperor, kept asking, until one day emperor called him to his presence. He said, "Come close, tell me, do you know how to keep a secret?" General got excited, said, "Yes, I do know how to keep a secret." The emperor responded, "So do I," implying just leave me alone. So keeping secret is easy. In fact, all you have to do is just keep your mouth shut. But that's not very productive either, of course. The emperor wants to share the secrets with his generals so that they can prepare better. General was right. And you, of course, want to be able to share your secrets selectively, maybe with your attorney, maybe with your accountant, doctor. Just keeping the secrets to yourself is not a solution. So we need to be productive. Long gone are the days of emperors. Individuals who can make all kinds of decisions with no oversight or no real accountability. Modern governments today, they balance powers to ensure accountability and to prevent abuse. The way they achieve that is by separating powers. First, we have legislative power. They make laws. They may decide we need a highway from this city to that city, with this many lanes and this kind of quality. Executive branch carries out the tasks. They hire the contractors to build the highway. They make sure that the quality is there. And judicial system makes sure everyone is playing by the rules. Even the legislative system, even the executive branch. For instance, they may deny the request to build the highway if the path of the highway is going through tribal lands or through national parks. Or they may punish the executive branch if they are not awarding the contracts fairly. It is reasonable to think of a modern operating system as a modern government. In this case, administrators are the legislative power. They can decide who runs which applications with what kind of authorization. Kernel system services, drivers, are the executive power. They allocate memory, they create processes, threads, they allocate CPU quotas, and they just perform those tasks. Arguably, the biggest difference of modern operating systems, the trusted computing base, which prevents the operating system from being a jungle, makes sure that everyone is playing by the rules, admins and kernel included. If we were to assume that admin equals to kernel, which equals to TCB, we would be taking a huge risk. For one, administrators are humans, and humans make mistakes. We may get really curious about an email we get from our friend. It says dancingcats.exe, and we have to see those cats dance. But if you double click on that, and if your entire machine is compromised, we don't want that. Also, who says administrators can be trusted at all times? They cannot be. Humans can play foul. Think of the gaming scenarios, anti-cheating point of view, or software licensing point of view. Or think of multi-tenant scenarios. Who says this administrator is the only administrator on the system? That may not be the case. There may be other administrators with certain security expectations. And who says this system is the only system on this hardware? There may be virtual machines with certain security expectations. So admins being equal to TCP is no-go. Kernel, on the other hand, one may argue, is just software, and like humans, they don't make mistakes. Maybe, but kernel is a big attack surface. In a typical operating system, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of system calls and ioctls. There's a huge attack surface. And in most operating systems, kernel is shared between OS and third-party drivers. And these third-party drivers may come from companies with questionable security policies. This is not a new problem. Microsoft Windows tried to solve this in the past. One of them is Authenticode, or kernel mode code signing. In principle, we are putting a reputation of an authenticated identity on the line. I trust Microsoft, Microsoft signed this piece of code, hence I trust this piece of code. That's well in theory, but in practice, strong verification of publishers by certificate authorities is questionable at best. And if one of them makes a mistake, revocation of the certificate is slow and a hard process. So this can't be the ultimate solution. Protected process, PP, or protected process like PPL, introduced in Windows Vista and Windows 7, in principle protects certain user mode processes, sensitive processes from the rest of the user mode, including the admin. If administrator tries to access, for instance, LSA-SS process, by injecting threads, it is blocked at the kernel. Or if it tries to read memory, write memory, it is blocked at the kernel. The problem is, it all boils down to kernel, and as we just saw, kernel cannot be the source of truth because of its attack surface, of its complexity. PatchGuard was designed to protect kernel itself. It limits what kernel mode can do in kernel. However, it is heuristic-based, and we are playing catch-up with the hackers. So that's not fail-safe. Furthermore, PatchGuard doesn't protect drivers from other drivers. Listen, I am proud of these technologies. These are designed and developed by people smarter than I am. These are good technologies, but they all have a fundamental flaw. They rely on software. We should root our security on something harder, something firmer. Let's take a quick look at hardware. In the long distance, on x86 and x64 systems, they have a single address space. Kernel ran in ring 0, and ring 0 had access to entire addressable physical address space. So if you get code execution in kernel, it means that you have the kernel, you have the God mode. With the hypervisor, we had another abstraction layer. It is similar to rings, but it is not implemented by the rings. There's nothing to do with the rings. It sits below them. Therefore, it's also known as ring -1. It roots its promises on hardware and on firmware. The difference from ring 0 is that it is very small, very, very, very small. Therefore, it is much easier to protect, and it is much easier to secure. Therefore, hypervisor and firmware, that small, simple space, can be our true trusted computing base. Now we have a place to store our secrets. But as I mentioned, the only goal is not storing the secrets, also being able to process them, to do something with those. So we need extra codes to make something intelligent with the secrets. The problem is, if we implement all that code in hypervisor, we are back to square one. Hypervisor gets more complex, it is more difficult to secure, and it is becoming a jungle, so we don't want that. How can we use hypervisor technology but not pollute hypervisor? Let me introduce virtual trust levels. Using virtualization technology and second-level address translation, sections of memory can be protected in a cascading fashion. Guest virtual can be mapped to guest physical, which can be mapped to system physical. That way, we can have islands of memory that is access protected from the rest of the system with the guarantees of hypervisor and firmware. This is the architecture we have today. Ring 3 user mode on the top, which has less access than we have Ring 0, the kernel address space, which has more privilege. And at the bottom, we have the hypervisor and the firmware. That's our trusted computing base. Let's call this VTL0. Instead of growing vertically, now we can grow horizontally. We have whole new dimension to add security. VTL1 isolates itself selectively from the rest of the system. By default, the rest of the system, including the Ring 0, cannot access VTL1. But VTL1 selectively may decide to share code or to share data pages with VTL0. And the beauty of that is, in the future, this can be extended. I'm not confirming or denying we will be doing that, but the flexibility is there. I'm just loving this architecture. Let's take a bit deeper look. This is our normal world today. We have threads running in processes, making calls in the kernel for executive branch support, and we have hypervisor keeping everyone in line. With VTL1, now we have a parallel of that. We have secure user mode and secure kernel mode, and in the secure user, we have threads, just like in normal user. Those threads run in processes called trustlets. Those trustlets still depend on secure kernel for certain things, creating threads, allocating memory, for instance. Secure kernel, in turn, relies on the normal kernel. I will explain the interaction in the next slide, but we are trying to reuse a lot of code to make the secure user and secure kernel as small as possible. In the user world, normal world can talk to secure user using RPC. Secure world is invisible. It is not a new application that you will see. There is no UI, no user interaction. It has minimal impact on performance. We are expecting, in fact, less than 2% of hit in most cases. It has much tighter control. There is not going to be any third-party code in the secure kernel. It's going to be all operating system provided code. Trustlets are isolated from each other, so even if one of the trustlets get owned, it's not going to be able to inject the others. Trustlets will be limited in number, they will be purpose-built, and they will be much smaller. Therefore, it is easier to protect, it's easier to secure. World is small, is the saying. Secure world is even smaller. The catchphrase here is code reuse. If there is no secure mode, perhaps because your hardware doesn't support it, trustlets can run as normal mode process, code reuse. Secure world relies on enlightened normal world Entos for many things. Scheduling, most of memory management, synchronization, again, code reuse. However, there are certain things that we do in secure kernel that make sure that secure kernel stays secure. For instance, configuring SLAD or encrypting the pages before they are being paged out by Entos is among those tasks. VTL0 is not trusted. It's an important notion to understand. The Ring 0 doesn't mean security anymore in this new world. VTL0 is not trusted. Secure kernel, while it is depending on VTL0, it does its job hardening against the system calls and return values. Keeping secure world secure is important, and it is not entirely free. Hypervisor depends on firmware, and therefore firmware is still part of the trusted computing base. It is small, but as we know, of course, any size of software can have bugs. In fact, Intel is presenting later this afternoon about the implications of firmware vulnerabilities. I really encourage you guys attend that presentation as well. So bottom line is Secure Vault is secure only if integrity of whole TCP is maintained. So I have two calls. One of them is a call to our partners. We are in this game together. Microsoft and Intel is partnering, and we are providing valuable tools. Please use those tools. Please engage with us, and please patch the security vulnerabilities in BIOS and other parts of the firmware in a timely fashion. And we have call to our customers. It is very important to keep the firmware and the BIOS up to date. Good news is, in Windows 10, Windows updates can make sure that your system is secure. So now, our Emperor has a way to store the secrets and also to intelligently process them, as my dear friend Seth will explain.
Thanks. So what I'm going to talk about here is how we can use this new architecture, using the hypervisor as a new, essentially lower ring, to secure legacy protocols. Before we can really dive into the architecture of what we've built here, I need to talk about a couple of primers. The first one is a word on credential strength. Not all credentials are created equal. So some credentials, such as passwords or naive cookies, are extremely weak because they can be very easily stolen. Cookies are stolen out of browser cache. Users are phished for their passwords or key logged very easily. So weak credentials are a problem. Strong credentials are credentials that we consider theft resistant, such as a smart card. A smart card requires physical theft, excuse me, to actually steal the card. Two-factor authentication is also not necessarily as strong, but strong. And this sort of leads to a law of physics of credentials, which is users with weak credentials, they get owned. They get phished, their passwords leak, their hash gets stolen, bad things happen. So we need to start with strong credentials. That said, I also feel it's important to talk a little bit about how we do smart card auth in Windows. Windows uses Kerberos, a standard protocol for performing smart card authentication. Kerberos, of course, is the three-headed dog, so it's a three-legged authentication protocol. You have your user, in this case, Alice, with her smart card, the KDC, Key Distribution Center. That's what you authenticate to. That's the authenticating property. And then some service you want to access on your network, which is the file server. So the first thing that happens is Alice enters her PIN. The smart card is used to do some proof of possession of a key. That proof is presented as an authenticator to the KDC, who hands back a ticket granting ticket, or TGT, and a key associated with that TGT. So the key needs to be used with the TGT. And then when Alice wants to access the file, the TGT is presented to the KDC, and then the KDC replies with a service ticket and a key. And then that service ticket is used to go get the files. So already we can see one thing that is going to be interesting to attackers to steal, and that is the TGT key. Because if an attacker has that key, they're you for a time-bound amount of time, but I believe it's 7 days by default in Windows. It's days of time, which is plenty. But there's more interesting stuff to steal. Whenever you get a service ticket in Windows, your NTOWF or your NTLM authentication hash, that is returned as well. And that was done years ago, I believe in Windows 2000, to support backwards compatibility with NTLM shares, because nobody even then could give up their NTLM. So now we've talked about two things in this diagram that are vulnerable to theft. So how do we protect those things? Well, this is sort of a zoomed-in version of the architecture Baris was talking about earlier, where we have the attacker. You can see that he is unable to access memory in IUM or secure world, and normal world, he's got free reign. We're assuming he's an administrator. And it's also important to note that all devices are in normal world. There's no device IO in the secure world, and everything there sits on top of the hypervisor. So in the new world, things look similar to the old world. LSASS continues to run. It continues to be vulnerable. It runs inside of normal world. And the vast majority of protocol logic is inside of LSASS. So byte buffer manipulation, things like that. What is new is Credential Guard, or CredGuard for short. It's a new process that runs inside of the secure environment. It's very, very small, and it contains protocol support logic. So anything the protocol needs to do with a secret, such as your NTOWF or a Kerberos key, that always happens inside of Credential Guard. That secret is never in LSASS. And then LSASS uses the protocol support logic with RPC. All the secrets are only ever in the clear in CredGuard. They may exist in an encrypted format in normal world. So we're assuming the attacker can steal the encrypted ones. It's strong encryption, 256-bit AES. Those secrets may be passed back into Credential Guard and used where they're in a decrypted form. The attacker here cannot access them. So let's zoom in just a little bit more and look at the specific artifacts we want to protect. So in the old world, pre-Windows 10, all these artifacts just sat in memory waiting for someone to run Mimikatz or something and slurp them out. In the new world, they only ever exist in the clear in Credential Guard, and they're protected from sniffing. So that's a pretty good first start, but it's not quite enough to really mitigate attacks. As noted earlier on the prior slide, devices are accessible in normal world. This includes your USB bus, which means if you're using, for example, a smart card, an attacker can sniff your smart card pin, keylog it, and then use that smart card to start the entire authentication process, go get a TGT, service ticket, and they can play the whole game. So you're still owned at this point. So we need something to prevent this avenue of attack. And the way we do it is by building a promise that the secrets are isolated. Since the attacker has Oracle access to your cred, they can still pass the hash. So we need to guarantee the isolation is actually happening, that it's not an attacker using your smart card. And so the solution here is actually an existing IETF standard, RFC 6113. It's astoundingly good bedtime reading if you can't get to sleep. It's an existing standard. We implemented it, I believe, in 2012 R2. It's out there in the field, and it provides something called compound authentication. So with compound authentication, you combine the user's credential with the machine credential in order to build proof of where the user is authenticating from. And so with this proof, we can build the promise that the artifacts that are returned to the client from the KDC remain hidden. So the first thing we need to do to leverage compound authentication is start with strong machine credentials. So machines in an Active Directory domain have credentials just like a user. They sign on to the domain. Prior to 2012 R2, the only credential a machine could use was a password. It was a high entropy, strong password. It was not dictionary attackable, but it was still stored on the device. It could be slurped out of RAM. It could be gathered off the hard disk. Not very strong. So what we need to do is use a private key, which is owned inside of Credential Guard, and that way we prevent attacker access to the key. So by combining this stronger machine authentication with a strong credential with compounding, which is provided by Kerberos Fast, and 2012 R2, that level of functionality, we can apply what we call an authentication policy, which dictates which systems a user is actually allowed to authenticate from. So let's talk a little bit more about exactly how this compound authentication works. So first we start with the machine ID key. The machine logs onto the domain just like a user and gets a TGT and a TGT key with that credential. From the machine TGT key, we now derive what we call an armor key. It's really a sort of proof of origin key that says, yes, I'm coming from a system which has access to this machine TGT. So our user, her credential is combined with the proof of origin in order to authenticate. And using this, we get the TGT for the user. So only by starting with a strong machine credential, combining the user's auth with that stronger machine auth, can we get the TGT. The policy is checked at the domain controller side. Since the attacker has no access to the machine ID key, not even Oracle access to this key, there's no way for the attacker to even start this chain to get a TGT. So the path we have here to get to a strong user involves users using only strong credentials. The systems need to be secured, and the systems need to be provisioned with a machine key, not a password, because passwords are just too easily stolen. And then authentication policies need to be set up on the domain controller, because that is where we really do the gatekeeping and prevent these stealable artifacts, these passable hashes and keys, from being returned to the device. So the first question almost everybody asks is, well, I'm just going to turn it off. It's on the client, right? This credential guard thing. So what makes it a little more than just client trickery? So let's just walk through it really quickly. So an attacker has taken over Alice's laptop, now has admin, and has found a way to disable credential guard protections. That's bad news, right? But if you notice, the machine identity key also goes away when credential guard goes away, because the only thing that can use that key is credential guard. So now, when Alice's credentials are used to request a TGT from the domain controller is going to check the policy, see that there is no proof of origin, there's no armor on that request, and say, nope, no way, I'm not going to give you what you want. So that said, we have a demo. So what we have here is, we have a domain and a couple of clients all running here. And so Alice is a user on this domain with a smart card, and we need to set Alice's password. So, anybody have a password idea? Someone yell loud. Password 123. All right, that's an awesome password. There we go. So we'll set her password, if I can type correctly. All right, so now we're going to go onto the clients and use Mimikatz and try to steal the hash for this password. So first, let's go to this system. This system has no, this one does not have credential guard enabled. So I'm going to log in here with the virtual smart card. And while that's, oh, that was cool. And then I've got a second system here with credential guard on, because I like T-Rexes better. And I'm going to log on there too as Alice. So it takes a little while to log on when I first rehydrate the VMs. But now you can see Alice is at her desktop. We have performed the complete dance with the domain controller. I now have a TGT, and the NTOWF is on this device. And as you can tell by the dreadful looking wallpaper, it's easily stolen. So I'm going to go be a bad guy and steal the password, if I can type. So the first thing we need to do is see what Alice's hash looks like. So I just got a little tool here that will dump the MD4 of the password, the NTOWF. So here we go. A9FD. We'll just remember the first four. That's good enough. So let's run trusty old Mimikatz and see if we can find that hash. Oh man, all kinds of good stuff dumping out here. So let's see, it should be at the top. Oh wow. So here we go, A9FD. That sounds correct, doesn't it? So Alice, you got popped, you're done. So that's no good. She should have known better because of the skull and crossbones. So let's look at this system, which is not running. So I should make it be known that Credential Guard currently is not actually supported in the RTM build, in the initial build of Windows on VMs. We have some private bits here to make things work. So let's log in over here. Let's be Alice again, except this time we're on the secure system. And so let's go run Mimikatz, and we'll see what it dumps out of LSA memory. All right, so while that's logging on, so you may have noticed that Alice is still not in a good position because Alice is able to log on to the Skull and Crossbones system, right? She's still very, very open to attack. So how do we prevent that from happening? What we need to do is use authentication policies. So here you've got an authentication policy set up with Credential Guard enabled. So what you do with that policy is apply it to a specific user, in this case, Alice. So Alice has this policy applied to her. And this policy says down below that Alice is only allowed to log on from IUM enrolled machines. So she can only log in from machines which have CredGuard, because those are the ones we trust. So once I enable this policy, now Alice can no longer log on from the ownable system. Okay. So while that's happening, let's go back over here. This is the awesome system. It's happy. Look at that. And it has Credential Guard running. So we can tell Credential Guard is running because it actually shows up right here in Task Manager. All right, so here we go. Credential Guard, it's running, eating a little bit of memory, waiting for you to authenticate. So Credential Guard's running, so let's see what Mimikatz dumps out now. So let's dump out the logon passwords. Good old secure ULSA. And once again, a bunch more stuff dumped out. But now you can see we're running just a build off of the head of Mimikatz's GitHub from a few days ago. You can see that Mimikatz now recognizes that, gosh, this is an encrypted hash. Oh, cool, you can see Windows is unhappy because I'm running Mimikatz. I'm going to ignore that toast like I ignore most of them and say, hey, look, there's no hash here, but Mimikatz recognizes that there's something encrypted here that is very resistant to attack. So now I've applied that policy now so we can go back to the first system. So if I can't log off Mimikatz. So now, if Alice tries to log on to a system that she is not actually authorized to log on from, let's see what happens. Oh no, I can't zoom this. Hopefully you can see it. It says your account is configured to prevent you from using this computer. That's what we want. This computer is vulnerable to attack. We want to block Alice from using this computer. And so what has happened is the domain controller has actually not sent any passable hash to this device, and it hasn't sent any Kerberos keys that can be stolen to this device. At most, what the attacker has is my PIN, which is 1234, the best PIN ever, and access to using that smart card on this device, but it's not really usable to log on from this device. So that all said, I did show you the group. We're doing a little bit of, I call it cooking show magic, where I kind of opened the oven and pulled something out. There's a cake. The machines are in groups, which is kind of weak. So the way we want people to actually use this is by enrolling machines with a certificate. And that certificate needs to contain a specific OID. So as of Windows 10, the CertRec tool, the built-in tool, now has the capability to enroll the machine with a certificate and key. So what happens is an RSA 2048-bit key is generated, and then a certificate signing request is made, and the device gets a certificate that it uses to authenticate. And this certificate contains an OID, and then we map that OID to the group. So the proof really comes not from the machine itself, that you just trust this machine and you know it's configured right. The proof comes from only Credential Guard on that machine has the certificate enrolled, and it is the only thing that is able to actually get that OID. And since it's the only thing that can get that OID, it's the only thing that meets the authentication policy and allows Alice to log on. Yeah, so that pretty much wraps up the demo. So I want to reiterate, we have designated steps to mitigating many known attacks, such as running Mimikatz or maybe Metasploit or something on a system. And I just want to go over really quickly what these steps are. The first thing you got to do is get rid of terrible protocols like MSChat v2 and NTLM v1. Those are really the same protocol, but they're terrible. They basically just blast your NTLM hash on the network with really poor encryption. I think 57-bit DES or something like equivalent DES. It's very weak. Users need to use strong credentials. Smart cards are good. Virtual smart cards are good as well. Devices need to support IUM, of course. There are hardware requirements, which we have documented. Windows 10 IUM support needs to be enabled. The credential guard cert, everything needs to be enrolled. All the documentation for the setup I've demoed here is online imminently. I was hoping it would be online before Black Hat. It's not there yet, but you'll be able to find it at microsoft.com/PTH. And from there, you can download the documents and set this up yourself. And it's ready to be tested in RTM now. Windows 10, download it, try it out. We'll have little time for questions, but before we get to that, I wanted to give thanks to some folks. One is the Microsoft VSM team. A lot of smart curl guys, a lot of smart hypervisor guys, memory manager dudes. Worked really hard to make this platform, and Credential Guard's just something that we've developed on top of it, that we run on it. And I'd like to thank Benjamin Delpy, the author of Mimikatz. He was super helpful, and he even updated Mimikatz when Windows 10 moved some things around in memory so that it actually recognizes, as you could tell in the demo, that we've got isolation on or Credential Guard on. So thanks to those guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, we've got, I think, 7 minutes for questions. Do we have a mic or something, or people just shout?
So you talked about runtime isolation. How do you ensure that the machine cert can't be extracted offline? Is there some sort of attestation you're using TPM?
Yes, if you have a TPM, the guidance is you really need a TPM, and if you've got it, the root encryption key for secrets, for trustlets, is bound inside of the TPM.
Do you want to repeat the question?
I'm sorry?
Repeat the question.
Oh, I'm sorry if you guys didn't hear that. He was asking, how do we prevent someone from just stealing the secrets, such as the machine key off the device? And if you have a TPM, we will use TPM to bind to the device.
I understand that the actual keys on TPM are all the actual disk and not all on the actual hardware. How do you protect the keys even though they're on the hardware?
Okay, so he's asking, he says he understands that the keys themselves for TPM are actually stored on the disk and not in the TPM. My TPM foo is not super strong. I think you're right. But what's on the disk itself is actually encrypted. So you have to import the keys off the disk into the TPM, and you get a handle to that key, and then that's what you use. So even if you steal the long-term storage of the keys for the TPM keys off the disk, they're encrypted. Is that? Yeah.
Is CredGuard in all builds in Windows 10 or just Enterprise?
It is SKU limited. It's not in all builds. Oh, he asked, is CredGuard in every build of Windows? It's on enterprise builds and education builds. I know, and I believe all server builds. The documentation, trust it when it's on the website more than me. Yeah, don't throw rocks at me if I get that wrong.
Will there be additional support for virtualization so that this can be used on servers that are in a virtual environment?
The question is if there's going to be any support for server scenarios. Yes, there's going to be. It is planned.
That's for VSM. Currently for Credential Guard, it's primarily a client-focused mitigation.
Does the domain need to be updated in any way to support the new pieces?
So that's an awesome question. He asked if the domain needs to be updated. We do rely on features in 2012 R2. So yes, you do need to be new, and that's newer than what many customers are, unfortunately. It does not have to be Windows 10 though.
What's the plan for releasing the private bits for the Hyper-V that lets you run VSM, the thresholds inside VMs?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the
Yeah.
question.
What's the plan for releasing the Hyper-V bits that allow you to run FrankGuard inside the VM as well? That's not possible.
Yeah, the question is, what is the plan for releasing the Hyper-V version that lets us run CredGuard in a supported fashion and not like the little hack we were doing here? It's going to be a server release. Any other questions?
You have to implement Microsoft CA to use this.
Oh, the question is, do you have to implement the Microsoft CA? That is a good question. I don't know. We rely on certificate templates, which is a Microsoftism as far as I understand, but I'm not sure. If you want to catch me later, I can follow up and find out for you.
Barish mentioned an effort underway to generate better and more secure code for firmware.
Yes.
What kind of confidence do we have that that's actually going to have the level of assurance that you need as a trusted database?
The question is, since all this depends on hardware and firmware, and since firmware is basically software, how much assurance we can get from this entire system? That's a good question. I have two responses to that. One of them is, by design, firmware is much smaller, and therefore it is easier to protect, easier to secure. The attack surface is incomparably smaller than anything else. But the true answer is, at the end of the day, it will have vulnerabilities, and the ecosystem must do its job to make sure that they are doing proper testing, proper security assurance before releasing. And after the release, they should keep maintaining firmwares. And our customers must install the updates as soon as possible. Again, the good news is in Windows 10, Windows Update will keep you secure automatically.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions, if anybody has some. Yeah, way back.
Will the VM support require Hyper-V or work on VMware?
The question is, will it work on VMware or does it require Hyper-V?
I don't think so. I don't know. Hyper-V is
Okay.
required.
And wherever support future VMware.
So yeah, I'm sure it requires our hypervisor, Microsoft hypervisor. Anybody else? Or? All right, well, thanks. Thanks for coming in today and listening to us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.